Fictional names tend to be pretty on the nose. I mean, just look at the Death Star. Yeah, it isn't the most telling of what exactly it does, but no one calls something the Death Star, and it's the headquarters of a massive charity organization. There's a lot of things like that in fiction, and Halo's no exception to it. The Halo rings are big old ring worlds named after religious objects and are the subject of religious worship. Not exactly subtle, but in particular, the member species of the Covenant are some of the most on-the-nose named beings in all of fiction. Prophets are the religious leaders of the Covenant, elites are the head of the military and the best fighters, grunts are the frontline fodder. You hear the names once and there you go, you've figured out what they're about. The funniest one to me though is the Brutes. You hear the name Brute and there's probably a lot of things that come to your mind, none of which I presume are good and all of which are right. The Jiralhanae are some of the most savage creatures in all of Halo. They eat people, they rip people in half, if you're lucky they do it in that order, and they're the shock troopers to end all shock troopers because throwing a mini King Kong at someone is a great way to ensure the battle is won. Today, let's look at Halo's own funny monkeys, because Tartarus was cool, but by the rings was he stupid. But before I begin, would you like to know how you can listen to this video in some darn high quality? Well, you're in luck because this video was sponsored by Raycon. Now that summer's here, people are out enjoying the weather with everything from walks in the park to cookouts. With Raycon's essential open earbuds, you can not only enjoy all these things to the fullest, but listen to whatever you please throughout. They sit just outside your ear canal, so you get clear sound but don't have everything else blocked out. They stay on perfectly, however, so there's no need to worry about them falling off, be you at the gym or just going about your day. And I assure you, the sound quality is just as good as any other brand and at a much more affordable price at that. Plus, and this is a feature I quite like since I am a perpetually forgetful person, they have 8 hours of playtime and the battery case has 36 hours of charge in it. As someone who sometimes forgets where his insulin pump is, it's nice to know that even if I forget to charge these bad boys, they'll still be ready to go at a moment's notice. I like to use them around the house doing chores. If the doorbell rings or my dog starts barking, there's no need to worry about me blanking out and missing it because I was too in the zone. I can be totally absorbed in what I'm listening to and still aware of the world around me. The essential open earbuds are a great option for everyday listening. Click the link in the description box or go to buyraycon.com/pancreasnoworkopen to get 20% off. Thanks to Raycon for sponsoring. Now then, let's see what happens when you evolve enough to be sapient but not enough to not chimp out. In fact, you know what? I'm a proud elite preferred species player. I'm breaking out the fictional racism right away. You know the idea of the missing link? That magical middle ground between apes and humanity? Well, that's the Brutes. So with a pin on that lovely topic, their history. The early history of the Jiralhanae is nothing of too much note. As a sapient species in the Halo universe, they were chilling out in their homeworld of Doisak 100,000 years ago before the librarian put them all in stasis as the Foreigners were about to fire the Halo array. After the rings fired and everyone who wasn't somewhere safe turbo died, the Brute species was reinserted into the galaxy like everyone else and inherited a world free of active foreigner rule and flood infestation alike. Beyond this, I don't believe there's much of anything. I don't think the Foreigner trilogy ever made specific mention of them doing much of anything, and the closest thing to something they might have thought is that the ancient prophets were hot. Apparently for everyone but ancient humanity and the Forerunners, this is what peak attractiveness looks like. The Brutes would, in all fairness, continue on as most civilizations did from there. I'll get more into it with their culture and biology, but they were always living up to the name humanity gave them. Case in point, an event known as the Great Immolation. For context, Halo technology is usually classified into one of 8 tiers representing a very broad level of technological ability. It's in reverse, so a Tier 2 civilization is more advanced than a Tier 3. The Brutes managed to reach Tier 4 at one point, which is early space-age tech up to colonizing their local solar system, and maybe nearby ones if something like generational ships are used. Not unadvanced by any means, since that's where we are nowadays and then some. Unfortunately, Tier 5 is the atomic age, which means the Brutes had by this point discovered nukes, and they were only too happy to use them on each other. The Great Immolation lasted about a decade, but saw Doisak ravaged and the entirety of Brute society near totally collapsing. They reverted back to Tier 7 technological status, which was anywhere from the Stone Age to right before industrialization, and I believe it was so catastrophic that they were in fact closer to the Stone Age level of things. While some isolated groups of them did manage to survive in their bunkers, their infrastructure was totally demolished. A regression not too unlike 40K's Age of Strife set in, and 2 of the continents on Doisak were so thoroughly destroyed and irradiated that they were put in quarantine after the war. When exactly this happened and how long it took the Brutes to recover is unclear, though I believe it did happen relatively shortly before they were discovered discovered by the Covenant, since by that year, 2492 to be exact, they had rediscovered radio and flight. So either they can actually do some remarkable science when they stop hitting each other for 5 minutes, or enough random bits of crap survive they could reverse engineer to get back on their feet fairly quickly. Speaking of though, the Covenant showing up that year, that's probably important. The Covenant arrived to a ruined Doisac and a ruined species. Though the brutes did initially put up a fight, they were at the end of the day only just rediscovering what to us would be modern day tech, and the Covenant were a sci-fi alien coalition. Integration into the Covenant followed swiftly is what I'm saying, though the brutes did take well enough to their newfound place for the most part. The Great Journey was something they threw themselves into, and the various chieftains such as one named Maccabeus took on some small leadership roles as shipmaster of a Covenant vessel. It wasn't perfect though. Brutes are of course brutish and tribalistic beings. That's why the Great Immolation occurred, as among other things tribal rivalries and differences in beliefs sparked a massive war. Elites meanwhile are socially hierarchical creatures that are more than happy to let you know that they are better than you. You can prove to them that you're worthy warriors and beings, and depending on the elite, they may damn well respect you as much as their fellow Sangheili, but it needs to be proved first. There's also a certain amount of elegance required for them to like you. Not fine table manners, but they're warriors, not savages. So here comes the species of apes that rips people apart for looking them directly in the eye, and boy oh boy did the elites not like them. Elites were always going to be ahead of them, as they were second in the Covenant hierarchy only to prophets, and in some matters outranked even them. On paper, the brutes could arguably be placed in third place amongst the Covenant, but in practice they were routinely given the worst roles by the elites. Maccabeus was an outlier for being allowed a ship, and the elites in charge of giving it to him basically stripped the thing of half its components before he was allowed to take command. Maccabeus incidentally responded by removing all the elevators and replacing them with ladders, because elite knees bend backwards and he knew they'd have trouble climbing them. Never let it be said that brutes don't at least have a sense of humor, but yeah, they weren't exactly treated well. They were able to command groups of lesser Covenant members, such as grunts and jackals, but in the Covenant, that is such a nothing burger of an honor. It's acknowledging that you're better suited for command than the grunts who will run at the first sight of danger, and the jackals who would rather be stealing from the Covenant are only there because the other option was to be glassed. Elites said that any methods or behaviors the Jiralhanai showed that indicated peace should be aggressively pursued, which is exactly as ominous as it sounds, and usually this led to the brutes being restricted from accessing the best Covenant tech. If you ever wondered why they usually use spikers instead of plasma weapons, that's why. They straight up weren't allowed to for the most part. Brutes before the Human-Covenant War were usually put on some form of guard duty, sent to particularly valuable planets and told to make sure no one steals whatever crap was there. They of course weren't given the tech to mine themselves or otherwise make use of it on their own. Such animals couldn't be trusted with that kind of advancement. Although for once that wasn't the elites doing, rather it was an easy way for the prophets to retain control over yet another client species. This would continue on for a relatively short amount of time, however. The Human-Covenant War started only a little over 30 years after the brutes were inducted into the Covenant, and they were actually one of the first races to make contact with humanity over the planet Harvest. This was by no means a planned thing. That Maccabeus fellow just happened to be the guy in the area making contact with humanity. The humans on Harvest laid out a feast of vegetables and fruit since they were paranoid that eating meat might come across as, well, brutish, if you'll excuse my choice of words. Brutes are carnivores, so this made things awkward, but it was at least a bit peaceful. Then an overeager grunt shot a member of the Harvest Militia, the prophets of truth, mercy, and regret declared mankind as deserving of extermination, and it was time for war. Brutes would serve with distinction, if not honor, during the Human-Covenant War, almost always as shock troops to rush in and both soak up bullets as well as destroy heavily fortified areas. In between those moments, they usually enjoyed themselves by rounding up humans and then eating them. Much of the way they were organized was to essentially take whatever clan they were a part of and more formally turn it into a military unit, since while the elites weren't fans of their culture or their anything really, they figured leaving the brutes as they were was good enough. In battle, they were savage monsters and didn't really give much of a damn about the morality or ferocity of mankind in fighting them. They were smaller than them, they were weaker than them, and so mankind was an enemy to treat as prey by and large. Though the rise of the brutes in the Covenant's ranks going forward wouldn't come from their own efforts, which I'm sure most of you are aware of if my assumptions about my audience are correct, they would become vital in the end stages of the war. The Prophet of Truth is a selfish, maniacal bastard. In other news, the sky is blue and there are forks in my kitchen. More than that, though, he was the culmination of thousands of years of the elites and prophets all trying to one-up the other in the Covenants. And lo and behold, here comes a race with pack mentality, so they'll follow the chieftain without question, full of religious fervor, and one that wasn't a fan of the elites the prophets so often argue with. Wouldn't it be funny if Truth just did a little switcheroo on everyone? The changing of the guard between elites and brutes was the first step in Truth's plan to rid the Covenant of the elites, and one that was swiftly followed by brutes replacing the elites in a variety of other positions as well. The timing of this event is something that Halo fans have been making fun of for some time, given that perhaps if Bro waited like another week, the rings would have fired and all would have been well. Of course, depending on how you view Truth's character, it does make some amount of sense. He had Regret killed, both to remove one of his fellow hierarchs from the position, as well as to do the same to the elites shortly afterwards. Replacing the elites with brutes meant he had a race of utterly loyal followers at his beck and call, and Mercy's death soon after only solidified his control of the Covenant. He hadn't foreseen that any Covenant members would side with the elites when the order to kill them all was given. Indeed, while I am getting a bit off topic, I've always liked to imagine that his portrayal in Halo 3 is different because he's a man realizing his efforts to take total control have been thwarted and the Covenant is about to come crashing down. Truth in 3 is a madman activating the rings in spite of knowing their true purpose because he's gone insane as his efforts are all shown to be for naught, and now it's a mix of proper religious madness and him giving a massive middle finger to everyone around him. He's going down, but the galaxy's going with him. Back on track though. The Great Schism saw elites and brutes finally take their rivalry to open warfare, and it was brutal to behold. Of course, 3 brutes to 1 elite is an even fight as the line goes, and the Covenant saw massive amounts of its former and present military leadership and forces annihilated. The brutes took on the roles of the elites, but between the losses of the Human Covenant War and the elites allying with humanity, their efforts were not enough. Even beyond that, they were inexperienced at leadership roles like this. At the end of the day, John Master Chief and the Arbiter destroyed the Ark and the Covenant was dismantled. Like the rest of the species in the setting, the brutes entered a world bereft of their former social structures. There was no Covenant to work for and with, and though this meant the elites weren't actively putting them down with laws and rules, it also meant that a species that had been intentionally left relatively primitive compared to everyone else now had even less infrastructure and whatnot to rely on. This was a common problem for all former Covenant member species, but for the brutes it was the worst. They couldn't feed themselves half the time, and so they turned to the one thing they'd become adept at under the Covenant: war. With each other, with the elites, with anyone who was nearby, essentially. Given that the two species had just been trying to kill each other outright, the brutes had no qualms raiding elite-controlled planets for resources. They weren't often attempts at permanent conquest, but rather quick actions into elite territory for anything from ships to weapons to just food. Countless different tribal groups and more waged war on each other as well, since no one in the Covenant was wrangling them anymore. Relatively low scale, but fierce fighting was common wherever they went, and certainly this was only fueled by the 1,000 different Covenant splinter groups that had arisen by this point. Some clans hidden across former Covenant space continue working on more or less restarting both it and the war with humanity, because as it turns out, a several thousand-year-old religion doesn't just vanish, even if it is provably incorrect. It wasn't all bloodshed, however, in spite of the species' nickname. Some brutes continued working alongside the Sangheili they formerly operated under. Oftentimes this was admittedly as slave labor, I won't lie, but sometimes they served as mercenaries, guards, or whatever else the elites that still tolerated them had needed them for. The brute chieftain Lytus even met with the Swords of Sanghelios, aka the Arbiter's folk, in a meeting meditated by the UNSC to try and achieve some measure of peace, even if only between a few brute clans that were willing. And of course, though a topic for its own video at some point or other, the Banished needs some mentioning. They're pretty cool, though perhaps this is because Halo Wars 2 was made by Creative Assembly. Take that statement as you will. Formed by the Geralhane Atriox, this wonderful mix of pirate group, Covenant successor faction, and brute clan is perhaps the ultimate proof that brutes can happily work with other people, as long as they're properly respected. Formed shortly before the end of the Human Covenant War, this rebellious group against the Covenant, though headed by brutes, takes on all who would join it. Elites, grunts, even humans. Join up with the Banished and they'll accept you gladly. The brutes within still beat the shit out of anyone that pisses them off and is led by the brutes, but it should be said that if a human can manage to impress the members of it, they won't give them too much shit. Prove you're as capable a monster as they are, and they'll have your back. They were able to stand against the might of the Covenant and now stand as the newest threat to the galaxy, albeit of course not in the numbers or force arguably even the pre-war UNSC could muster. I know that Halo Wars 2 scene of Atriox's backstory says the Covenant couldn't contain them at the height of their power, but I also assume that's partially the AI Isabel who was saying it being terrified, and partially something that from what I understand has been at least slightly walked back from. And before we move on to the next section, Halo 5. Sure sucked, didn't it? Well, it sucked even harder for the brutes. Atriox at some point had become a proper symbol for the brutes, and his Banished, though accepting of other races, was still ultimately a predominantly Geralhane organization. By and large, he had control of the homeworld Doisak and was getting ready for more and more ambitious things. And then Cortana pulled a million foreigner deathbot things out of her asshole and told everyone to bend the knee. Much like most everyone else, Atriox refused. Unlike, say, the UNSC, however, which I believe only really had their headquarters in the city of Sydney exploded, all of Doisak was exploded by Cortana. So that sucks for them, and nothing of value was lost. Biologically speaking, brutes are mammals that have characteristics of everything from gorillas to bears and are even classified as a sort of half-ursine in nature. Their scientific name amongst humanity, Cervus ferox, translates to wild slave, because subtle names is something Halo never quite got the hang of, like I said. Their homeworld of Doisak had about twice as strong of gravity as Earth, which is why they're all so powerfully built and tall. Every time I read that, I swear I've read that in higher gravity, creatures would be shorter and squatter, but enough people say it doesn't necessarily work like that I've just given up trying to understand it. I'm not a biologist by any means. Regardless though, yes, brutes are incredibly strong. In fact, as a species, they're almost all stronger than not only elites, but Spartans, capable of ripping them apart if given the chance. They'll kick, claw, punch, and indeed even bite with their powerful teeth and jaws in battle, and when they enter a berserker fury, you can really see why someone gave them the nickname of Brute. Their blood is purplish red, which I'm sure someone smarter than me knows what that means for its composition, but I really don't care, to be honest with you. And of course, they're covered in fur as well, which comes in a variety of types and shades, but tends to favor that of brown, and white fur like Tartarus had is a rare trait. They're carnivorous beings, and they'll eat anything that's made out of meat. Anything, sapient or not. And you know, how about I take things back to the beginning of the video again when I said rather impolite things about the brutes as a race. I believe it was in the Halo Evolutions anthology, though with how often I read Halo books and how quickly I did one after the other, it could be damn near any Halo book, where some humans are prisoners of the brutes. We are told if you look them in the eye, they take it as a challenge and eat you. Sure enough, someone looks one of them in the eye and is killed, and I believe eaten. It doesn't need to be intentional either. If you catch their eyes, you get killed and eaten. Sometimes they'll even do it on purpose, making you look them in the eyes so they have the excuse. They release pheromones so this can be controlled, which of all things reminds me of the Skaven, and while they are savages, their pack bonds are strong. They go into the berserker fury whenever their mates are killed and don't stop until they or whoever killed their buddies is dead. There's overall less to talk about than the other times I've talked about Halo species biology though, because, well, they're big monkey men. You know what a monkey is. I know what a monkey is. They're big monkey men. Sci-fi monkey men, but in the same way if you look a gorilla in the eyes it'll kill you, so too will a brute. The difference, of course, being that a gorilla probably won't eat you after the fact. Brute culture has always been a highly tribalistic sort of affair. Them going berserk when you kill their fellows is equal parts cultural and biological after all. Aside from the Banished, they've historically lacked a single governing body, as evidenced by the fact that they nuke themselves into oblivion, but you can divide them into roughly two categories of type, for lack of a better word. These groups, called Skeins, do in actuality come in a larger variety than that, but there's only two meaningful groups that make up most of Jiralhane society: the Ratol and Vailoth Skeins. The Ratol are the classic idea of what a brute is. Savage and violent, they're the least open to diplomacy and working with others in general, preferring instead to let their strength do the talking. Indeed, Ratol brutes are the sort that happily rip you into pieces for nothing more than the idea of doing it to ya. They're the reason for the Great Immolation, when one of their chieftains by the name of Rookt more or less sparked the conflict. The name Brute doesn't begin to describe it, and when they joined the Covenant, they were even at least somewhat hesitant of accessing the technology that the elites were withholding from them. After all, becoming reliant on tech means you'll be less able to rip someone in half barehanded without it, and this led to them outright disliking the Prophets for granting it to the species. In spite of being the more savage ones, they do have some more interesting aspects beyond Unga Bunga Guy. Brutes on the whole happily embrace the Great Journey of the Covenant. Their previous religion based on Doisak's moons and totems and whatever apparently wasn't the most fulfilling thing. Many of the Ratolskine did indeed embrace it happily, such as Tartarus, but others only did so out of practicality. It gave them an answer, so they joined up in the Ford or worship, but even further than that, some only did so because it was expected of them. When the Covenant broke apart, all brutes raided to some degree, but the Ratolskine did it because they loved it. It showcased that they truly were superior to their enemies, that the Jiralhane were the mightiest, and they the mightiest of them. Tartarus sure enough was a member of them, and one of the more faithful, if him beaming Johnson over the head with Guilty Spark before nearly lighting the halos didn't prove that to you already. The Vailoth Skein is by contrast the more reasonable ones. Oh, they'll still rip you in half, but outside the battlefield, they're the ones you want to talk to if you have to talk to a brute. Much more sociable, I suppose is one word. These are the lads that can talk things out. I'd wager that they're the ones behind many of the brute's weapons manufacturers, which yes, those do exist, since these lads are less focused on pure smashing their way through all of life. They also raid after the fall of the Covenant, but they viewed it as a grim and unfortunate necessity. Much less about them exists, however, since in a universe like Halo, the reasonable folks that always talk things out tend to be told to quiet down before someone starts shouting about heresy or explaining why it's vital we kidnap these children to turn into super soldiers. But hey, if you're ever reading a story with a logical and somewhat reasonable brute, it's probably one of these fellas. Below these massive groupings lies the Alpha tribes. These are large groupings of loosely aligned brute packs that are likely held together by a particularly dominant tribe, or perhaps even individual brute chieftain. A lower sub-level of their culture, basically, with their own individual groupings, but able to be matched up with one of the larger skeins. That said, from what I understand, Alpha tribe, as well as the term Master Pack, might also just be another way to say skein. Brutes aren't exactly the friendliest of folks willing to explain the ins and outs of their culture to outsiders. They're more for demonstrations, and they're favored of showing you firsthand just how strong they are by ripping your arm off and beating you to death with it. And then we have individual clans. Strong ones are all brute and led by a powerful chieftain, while weaker ones might have significant numbers of grunts and are led by some random schmuck only in charge either because he's all that's left or because no one cares enough to take his spot. It's always a he though, since brute culture is fiercely patriarchal. Culture varies from clan to clan. Some clans shave the entirety of their bodies, others refuse to completely. Some have shaggy unkept fur, whilst others are so well groomed you could enter them at a dog competition and they'd win first place. Maybe they have mohawks, maybe they have no hair on their heads but some beards are present, and maybe they have goddamn afros. They also take the suffix us to their names, both because brute names are all Latin or Greek sounding and as a sign of military honor. Chieftains lead these clans, as I said, and it's always the strongest brute. A gravity hammer of ceremonial value was the badge of office, the most famous of course being Tartarus's and his Fist of Rooked from the chieftain Rooked. As you can likely guess, the way a new chieftain is decided is by challenging the current one. If you win, you kill him and take his place, and if you lose, you are dead and the chieftain proves he still deserves to rule by virtue of his might. Brute culture means that oftentimes it's a father killing or being killed by his son, which although savage, apparently rarely if ever causes hurt feelings in the about to be killed brute. One chieftain was even honored to be slain by his son, as it meant he had guided his offspring and clan well. There's not even any rules against challenging a chieftain while he's injured, though also of note is that if you fuck up, being the chieftain's son or something isn't going to save you from punishment. Not if it's a severe enough mishap at any rate. On the topic of weapons, meanwhile, because I'm not sure where else to put this bit, but I want to talk about fictional weapons, brute weapons are absolutely designed with their biology and attitudes in mind. As you can see from the brute shot and spiker weapons, that are almost always given a bladed edge, rarely involve plasma given their limited access to such tech, and cause a hell of a wound when they hit. They're savage creations, presumably designed by the more forward-thinking Veloth brutes, but brutes they are nonetheless. The same goes for their vehicles, covered in bladed edges and designed as brutally functional as possible. Fun fact about the chopper, incidentally, it was originally designed by an engineer as a piece of farming equipment, a gift for the people of Harvest. Then the brutes strapped guns and more blades on it and used it for warfare. Oh, those lovable scamps. On that note, the Jiralhanae also have no compunctions against using human weapons. Unlike the elites who viewed it as dishonorable, brutes were more than fine to rip your weapon out of your hand and kill you with it. Assault rifle, rocket, shotgun, they didn't care what it was as long as it helped them hurt people, which is equal parts savage and fairly egalitarian in some ways. Give a brute a weapon and he's happy, don't matter what kind. Might as well end off on some of the more notable ones, shall we? Let's start with Maccabeus, that fella I mentioned a bit already. He was a chieftain granted the right to be a shipmaster and did the funny thing of replacing all the elevators with ladders, as I said, but he's a fair bit more interesting than that bit of black comedy. In spite of being a Ratolskein brute, he was deeply religious. He fully believed in the divinity of the Forerunners and that the Great Journey was right. The ladder thing was also a weird bit of practicality and humbleness. You could go up or down as needed on a ladder without needing to wait for the elevator to stop, and he felt it humbled him. There was no technology involved that carried him up and down, just his own strength to climb with. A bit strange, but hey, whatever makes a guy happy. He climbed to the rank of chieftain by killing his dad, and indeed his father was the one I mentioned who was proud to be killed by his beloved son. He led his clan as well as possible, and was one of the most important figures around by virtue of being the chieftain in charge of the Covenant force when they landed on Harvest and contact with humanity was made. The fighting broke out as discussed, but though Maccabeus would go on to briefly fight humanity, he didn't fully believe the prophets when they gave the order to glass Harvest. He instead was determined that he would find out why the luminary device on his ship was saying there were millions of relics down there, even after the prophets told him it was just a faulty reading, not quite realizing that it was showing the glyph of a Reclaimer, which marks humans as the successors to the Forerunners. His ship was damaged and himself injured in the fighting, whereupon he was challenged for position of the pack's leadership by his nephew. Wounded and his faith shaken, he was defeated. His last words were telling his nephew to remember what the age the Covenant was in at the moment truly meant. A rather vague statement unless you know that that's how the Covenant keeps track of their years, and that the Covenant were presently in the Age of Doubt. His nephew, for his part, caved to Scullin with his hammer, the Fist of Rooked, and took command of the pack from that moment forward. On that note, let's talk about Maccabeus' nephew, because it's Tartarus in all his Halo 2 glory. In spite of the tone I've talked about the brutes thus far and his own appearance, he's a decent bit more complex a character than you might think. He's got equal showing at least to his uncle in the book Contact Harvest, and that's a fun read, so if you haven't read it yet, go do that. He was also at that initial ill-fated meeting on Harvest, and the grunt who caused the affair to erupt into violence was under his command. Since the grunt jumped the gun and ruined negotiations, Tartarus threw him off a waterfall as punishment. Quite the way to show you were dedicated to the talks going well, I suppose. He would participate in the battles that followed and showed he could be an actually upstanding sort of person. When the spirit dropship he was aboard was taken down by missile fire, he was nearly killed, but still did everything in his power to try and save his packmate from burning to death. He failed, and the event caused him to begin questioning his uncle's ability to lead. Still though, he did have some more good faith actions to be done. An engineer that had joined the ship's roster shortly before Harvest was being assaulted by drones who were upset the engineer was supposedly stealing their jobs as the ship's maintenance department. He fought the drones to save the engineer's life, rather selfless if I say so myself. After the ship was damaged, he finally decided to confront his uncle. Clearly his uncle's insistence there were forwarder artifacts on the planet was baseless nonsense, something that technically was correct given that it was just showing people. Though Maccabeus was wounded, Tartarus had a bit of honor in him and emptied out his own weapon, allowing Maccabeus to also wield the Fist of Rook during the battle. Tartarus then wrestled it out of his hands and smashed Maccabeus' skull in, taking his place as chieftain, which he's happily used many times to prevent challengers of his own from taking his place. This would set him on a path to become the right-hand man of the Prophet of Truth. A loyal brute to the prophets and brutes only more or less, Tartarus would be Truth's main enforcer after a few years and did no small amount of wet work for him. When the shards of a foreigner crystal capable of bending space and time were recovered by him, Truth had him reward and then execute those who initially found it. That sort of thing was common for Tartarus. He was eventually made chieftain of the brutes, which had never been done before. For the first time, all brutes in the military were under one command of one brute, him, and given the lore that follows, this means he was essentially in charge of the entire Covenant military, if only briefly. Halo 2 is where most of the rest happens, so I won't belabor the point too much. Go play Halo 2 if you somehow haven't. When Truth decides brutes are in fashion and elites gotta go, Tartarus is made the head and tosses the Arbiter down a big hole with his hammer. He showed he was clearly loyal to Truth, but also still could regret the actions this let him down, since when the Prophet of Mercy was attacked by the Flood, he clearly showcases some remorse over leaving a hierarch to die to the parasite. And he showed his loyalty to the Covenant's cause beyond all reason, when after Guilty Spark spells out the purpose of Halo in front of him, he throws a fit and tries to kill the Arbiter, Johnson, and Miranda Keyes anyways. At least there's this really cool artwork that came out of it eventually. You get the feeling that this really is the culmination of the elites versus the brutes, of the martial prowess and mastery of the Sangheili versus the unrivaled strength of the Jiralhanae, as opposed to what it is in Halo 2 itself, which is waiting for Sergeant Johnson's AI to stop bugging out and finally fire the goddamn beam rifle at Tartarus while you sit 2 stories above the guy taking potshots at him in the 2 seconds his shields are down. As much as the War in Eternal showing up 5 million times deserves plenty of criticism, Halo never quite managed to nail down a traditional boss fight. To end off, Atriox, the bastard whose name they say a million times in Halo Infinite that unless you played Halo Wars 2, you didn't realize was an actually cool sort of fella, if one I think doesn't have nearly the gravitas the Halo devs seem to think he does. To be fair though, look at the guy. That's pretty cool looking. As a brute, he was inducted into the Covenant military when they were discovered, and eventually rose to become the chieftain of his own little pack. Sort of. See, he had a habit of being the only guy to survive suicide missions again and again, charging into UNSC gun lines even if the battle was clearly already won. One mission he was lucky enough to not be surrounded by the corpses of his brethren saw him blow up a warthog with a fuel rod gun before he crushed the surviving sergeant with a gravity hammer. He at least let her stand up and draw her knife first. That was something he gave her. After enough of these events though, he begun questioning everything. His faith, which was never that strong, wavered further, and even questioned what the point was of trying to wipe out humanity. Not that he had a problem killing humans, more so the entire affair just seemed wasteful. He even let a wounded Marine live a bit longer while he monologued about all those thoughts he was having before ultimately killing him, because sometimes a guy just has to vent a bit, you know? His thoughts were eventually found out, and he was slated to be executed. During the execution, however, he killed his would-be executioner, which inspired his packmates to rise up around him, killing the stationed elites and now officially becoming their own thing. The banish began here, but it was humble beginnings. Early on, they were just raiding stuff. Covenant depots here, training sites here, mostly for supplies, but even this early on Atriox was an egalitarian. If you wanted to join up, he'd let you, species be damned. The UNSC and Oni in particular caught wind of his activities and realized he was his own separate faction rather than another brute chieftain when they noticed that he and the Banished were taking the stockpiled weapons that UNSC armories held. No previous reports of the Covenant doing this were ever received, because why would they steal inferior weapons they had no need of? He also at one point strangled an engineer to death and plugged a breach in a ship's hull with the guy's corpse. His reasoning being either he was a spy or completely incompetent, and either way he was pretty pissed right now, so death it was. That's a character-defining moment and metal as hell. He'd continue on like this, recruiting more warriors and gathering supplies wherever he could. He was a brutal warlord, but let it not be said his soldiers were treated like tools. In his own words, that's why he left the Covenant, because that's all those under the Prophets ever would be. He, meanwhile, would get followers through his deeds, and he even proved this by destroying a device that could pretty reliably mind-control drones. When confronted with an elite squad seeking the death of all brutes they came across, he even went so far as to say that vengeance was petty and had no meaning. He offered the elites a chance to break free of the shackles of their old faith and prejudices, so that they could be crusading warriors free of such burdens. That earns him some credit in my books, given that elites nearly took his head off for heresy. The leader of that squad of elites didn't agree, incidentally, but his former allies, well, here's the comic page. That ain't Atriox backstabbing the elite, I'll tell you that much. Much of his history going forward is stuff that you can easily find in Halo Wars 2 and Halo Infinite. For the former, just go play the game. For the latter, I'm sure you can find some cutscenes on YouTube. But the Banished, led by Atriox, had a merry time on the wreckage of the Ark outside the Milky Way, only being partially thwarted when the Spirit of Fire of all things reappeared and began raising hell for him. And while this might also be taken as the Flood being played down a bit, the line "he may not be as merciful as the Flood" being spoken about Atriox by one of the two morons who unleashed it is a wonderful sentence, isn't it? Really says volumes about how scary this bastard is in their eyes. It's like that scene in Return of the Jedi where Vader says the Emperor is not as forgiving as he is. That says so much about his character. He was presumed dead for some time, during which his lieutenant Escharum took command of the Banished, and Atriox apparently lived. I wish Halo Infinite's plot inspired anything in me. Even the hate everyone feels for 5 is better than the nothing I feel when I think of Infinite's campaign. At least it's a feeling. And on that lovely note, that was the brutes. They're brutish. I can't think of any funny way to end this video. Shout out to that brute in Halo 3 you can find pissing in a corner, I guess. I wish there was an achievement for sticking him in the nuts with a grenade. Thank you as always to my wonderful channel members. You are the brutes to my covenant, smashing everything in the way of the great journey, whether or not it's correct to do so. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching and take care out there. Gravity hammer, I hardly know where. There is no escape, there is no escape. The flood of breach containment, corruptor protocol has been declared. There are no hoes here. You are going to die and join a choir of 1,000 corpses.